So, as I go through, I'm going to give you 12 examples of things that I thought about that kind of precipitated a move of God. And as I go through, I'm going to give a biblical example, I'm going to give a personal example, but then I'm asking you if you ever feel like, oh, in our church, that same thing happened because of that. I want you to interrupt. I'm serious. Just raise your hand, and tell your story. And then when we get to the end, I'm going to try to be disciplined to end with like 20 or 30 minutes where we're done early. Then I want to hear from you all, like what things have you seen in your church or in your personal life where when you did this, it kind of seemed to open the door for a move of God. Does that make sense? So what we're basically this session is we're really brainstorming to say, okay, God, it's totally up to you when you sovereignly move. But there are certain things I found in my life and in our church's life that when we did that, it led to a move of God. So this was very helpful exercise for me. I've been a lead pastor now for 40 years. And so to kind of have the opportunity to look back over those 40 years, it was really kind of a helpful thing. I'm kind of embarrassed I didn't do it on my own. Because, to stop and just kind of say, that's the advantage of those of you that journal. Does anybody journal in here? Okay, see, you guys are way ahead of me. I've never been a journaler. Okay, I like to talk, I don't like to write. So, but you journalers, you have an advantage because you can actually look back and say, hey, God moved in this situation. What preceded that? In my journal, what kind of things did we do in order to see that happen? Any of you ever heard of a preacher from Manhattan named Tim Keller? Anybody know Tim Keller? Okay, fabulous. We're talking one of the top 10 church leaders in America today. Just a phenomenal guy. And I grew up Presbyterian, and so he mentored my best friend, and then Tim Keller's best friend mentored me. So those are my roots before I got connected with American Baptist and then Transformation Ministry. So anyway, Tim Keller is arguably one of the top 10 church leaders in America today. Okay, unfortunately, he might be dying of cancer now. He's older, but dynamic, awesome story of how God used him. Well, he actually pastored the church plant for my home church in Hopewell, Virginia. And that's where I grew up, and Hopewell, Virginia is the armpit of America. Okay, we're talking the exact opposite of what's out that window. Okay, listen, Hopewell, Virginia, chemical capital of the South. How do you like that? Everything was polluted. There's a smell to the city. They literally, our chant when we played them in football was, I smell, you smell, we all smell Hopewell. So, it just had this terrible thing. So, at any rate, so Tim Keller comes and he pastors this little Presbyterian church. Okay, I'm telling you, that when you know what happened with Tim Keller eventually, people are blown away by this. Maybe that church grew from 70 to 80 people over the 8 years he was there. Tim Keller. I mean, that would be like saying, if you don't know Tim Keller, it would be like saying Rick Warren pastored a church, and in 7 or 8 years it grew from 70 to 80 people. You'd be like, what? Okay, I remember going to Sunday evening services there, and there'd be like 30 people there, and I'd be sitting there going, this guy's kind of good, he's really good, but 30 people there. So anyway, so then he goes to teach at seminary, Westminster Seminary, very kind of brainy, if you're Presbyterian, it's kind of a brainiac kind of seminary in Philadelphia. And everybody's like, oh, that makes sense. He's a professor, he's not a pastor, he's a professor. Which we all know as pastors is like the worst insult ever. That's code for their sermons are super boring. That's what that's code for. So anyway, so he goes to be a professor. Everybody's like, oh, that makes sense. Totally. But he leaves there after 2 years, goes to Manhattan in New York City to target yuppies, like, young, upwardly mobile, professional. Boom! The thing just blows up. Just unbelievable.
Wow.
Okay, so I'm sitting there thinking, he goes to this one church, and from a human viewpoint, very little happens, you know what I mean? Then he goes to this other situation, it was actually a church plant, so it didn't even come to anything, and the thing blows up. Okay, God must be sovereign in when He chooses to have things grow and when He doesn't, you know. And by the way, just a little bit of a pet peeve of mine is when we go to these conferences and somebody tells us these are the 10 steps for your church to grow. And what you don't know is that demographically 2 million people moved into their backyard in the last 6 years. You know, and they're like, hey, here are my principles. Oh, okay, well, here's my principle. Move to a place where 1 million people are moving in. So, did I sound better with that? You know, so, just forgive me on that. So God's sovereign, but what can we do? What are some things we can do that help us? And for those of you that just came in, interrupt me when you have an example from your church. Okay, so now I'm going to start with low-hanging fruit. I'm going to start with just super spiritual, just, you know, just stuff that like, duh, okay, just like today, I loved it when he said that he was going to preach on, was it God saves the lost, or when only God can save the lost? He says that's like telling a group of Chili's employees, we sell food. So the first few ones are going to be like, we sell food, okay. But then I'm going to get into some weird ones towards the end, so hang with me. First 6, typical. Second 6, not so typical. Okay, number 1, an encounter with God's Word. Just some kind of fresh encounter with God's Word. As I look over my 40 years as a pastor, that has precipitated a move of God. It just kind of like, it kind of just like did something, and all it was handing out copies, and it had an evangelistic quotient to it, another thing, but just handing that out. And it makes me think of, you know, the king, Joash, I believe, or Josiah, that when they were digging through the rubble of the temple and they find a Bible that they hadn't had for centuries, a copy of the Bible. And it says when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robe. So sometimes just some kind of something to do with a fresh encounter. You know, sometimes even churches, I've heard them, when they just do a Bible reading program for the first time, or just something of that nature, it just kind of triggers something new that happens. Second one is another low-hanging fruit, prayer and fasting. Just a period of prayer. Was that fascinating what Josh Huseman said? Did I understand him right to say the Hussites prayed for a century before they sent out any missionaries? Wow. That was crazy, wasn't it? You know, I have to admit, after 100 years, I'd say maybe you're just lazy and you don't want to go to the mission field. You know, but no, they prayed for a whole century to preceding that. And so I've heard of that within churches when they do some kind of intensive prayer ministry, that will lead to some kind of move of God. Here are just a couple of quotes that I just love that I've come across. My wife shared these with me the other day. Leonard Ravenhill said, God doesn't answer prayer, He answers desperate prayer. And I know that's kind of Christianity 101, but that struck me. Like, I really have noticed the difference between prayer and desperate prayer. And then I love this, I stole these from Eric Holmstrom. Where's Eric? Right there, yes. You and your wife have been reading Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire with Jim Cymbala. Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. He says, God is attracted to weakness. He can't resist those who humbly and honestly admit how desperately they need Him. Our weakness, in fact, makes room for His power. And then the second one, if we do not yearn and pray and expect God to stretch out His hand and do the supernatural, it will not happen. We must give God room to operate. And then the third one is a great cause. And I love this in the story of Nehemiah, where just some fresh vision, like a church plant. Some of you are in turnaround churches, where you're turning them around the direction they've been. Sometimes it could be a building program. Sometimes it can be you add a worship service. And so I've done 3 of these. Do any of these resonate with you? Do you have anybody have a story here about either God's Word, prayer, or some great cause that caused the move of God to happen when you took that step? Anybody willing to share something, break the ice on that? It's okay if you don't. Yes, go for it.
What comes to mind is not exactly my story, but I was a part of, but our senior pastor, this was 10 years ago, and I remember I wanted to be very evangelistic. I was like, Pastor Drew, like, I want to go out, I want to go, like, you know, pray for people and do this like at like the town squares, and he's like, actually, he's like, what I feel God's saying is starting something called sign ministry, where we just create these like 5 by 3 feet signs. We just stand on the street, and as people drive by, we just wave, and people stop me, give them an invite card, and we've seen so many amazing families come to our church just from his obedience to do what God called him.
Is it holding a sign
Yeah.
and waving at people as they go by?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Sam will say something like,
You don't have to be perfect to come to church.
Your life, your
Your life
we're
has
on
a
the way to
purpose.
meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your life has a purpose.
Your life has a purpose.
Man.
And then our church address.
And arrow.
You're stealing our stuff here.
Yeah.
Okay, and by the way, those of you from Hope, you have an awesome pastor.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, that's so cool. And it just kind of sparked something when that took place. Okay, anybody else have an example? Anything so far? Yes?
I was in a home before where we were just actually we were just eating beans and rice, and you know, I'm Asian. I love rice, but I didn't eat the beans. But praise to God, you know. So anyways, we've been doing that for months, and we were hoping that we would eat something else. You know, you guys want, the pastor goes, you guys want to eat other food, why don't you guys pray about it? So we started praying, and you know, and we had this Bible study, and they were talking about fasting if we want to make this happen, and that's what we all did. And we visualized the kind of food that we want to eat, and you know, it says in the Bible where you have to be specific on the prayer. So people were praying about spaghetti. I prayed for chicken. Before you know it, you know, all that prayer. So some people were laughing about, well, that's all fantasy stuff, you know. But just a matter of weeks, people start donating stuff from everywhere. We were getting turkey, bacon, and all kinds of meat. You couldn't even never imagine.
There was a cause.
Oh man, that is awesome.
And we were praying like ever before. If someone was falling asleep, you got someone trying to put fire on that person, interceding, and next thing you know, he's fired up. And then the next thing you know, the whole people inside, we were all on fire. You know, I think like we don't even want to eat. I mean, if you touch us, you'll be on fire.
You know, what's that say? You know, Dane, maybe you
We
can
were
help
on the
me on
cutting
this.
edge.
Yeah, if you want to see a different result, you got to do something different.
Yeah.
How's
Doing the
that?
same thing over and over again is insanity.
Yeah, insanity. You just keep doing the
Doing the
same.
same
But
thing,
doing
making
something
different
fresh, something different, that just kind of strikes with the blood on that.
What I
That's
like
cool.
about that, sir, is it took like someone initiative and to get everybody involved. It's kind of like igniting a fire.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, the whole room is on fire.
Amen.
And God is there, man. I see it.
How about one more? Yes.
Something from many years ago in a galaxy far, far away in what is now Moreno Valley, my first church after our mutual school. I had a course in Nehemiah in the city of Boston on Christian education, and part of it was to do a Nehemiah walk. And back then they were large rural blocks, so I went on a Nehemiah walk all the way around, and I met a refugee from Vietnam. And then I got back to the church driveway and I saw this little girl peeking out at me. And so I motioned over and we talked outside. And out of those 2 meetings came an English as a second language class and a youth group. She made this sweet little sign for me to hold as the students were walking from the elementary school. I mean, no great shakes, but still some God blessed by going for a walk.
Amen.
Wow.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of the more traditional things, you know, adding a worship service, you know, I know at Center Point, you guys like add a worship service every month or something like that. But, you know, or a building project sometimes can do that. Yeah, they unify people, just that kind of thing. I mean, we've been doing these renovations in the middle of the pandemic, which we got a little bit of criticism for, because like, how are you spending money on buildings when there's so many people hurting around? But it's amazing. But by the way, we did it because of you.
Ooh,
I was gonna say,
yeah,
it's
our
a
story,
wonderful time
yes,
to
it's a
build
miracle.
because
Yep.
nobody was there. We could be messy and
Because it was
dirty and
empty.
crazy. Yeah, it was awesome.
Empty church means you
Yeah.
could do work. Well, no, I want to tease you right now. For some reason, this is, how when you're this old, can you remember something that happened 5 minutes ago while you came into a room? But I can remember something you said last time we hosted Transformation Ministries at our church. You talked to me about there were some springs coming up through the sea. You probably don't even remember that. Yeah, you said, you know, you got a problem there. Well, I want you to know we fixed all those seas. It took us
Spirit
like,
of excellence.
took us like 7 years, but you know. Yes, what you say?
Oh, I was gonna say, well, when COVID was hitting, we wanted to build an outdoor patio at Hope Community, and we thought we didn't want to. Pastor Drew didn't want to put all that money into the building if we didn't have it already fundraised. But we went ahead and
It was prior to COVID though.
Yeah,
It
it was
was,
prior to
and
COVID.
it was prior, and God had gave him a vision that we needed this outdoor
to
project.
start now.
To start now in 2018.
Wow.
And before that, I don't even know, but anyway.
When COVID
We only
hit,
missed 3 weeks
and
of
we were allowed
church.
to do outdoor
Within
services,
mandatory.
thank God we built our patio because we got to do
It opened just
outdoor
in time.
services.
So God told it to you ahead of time.
Yeah,
Yes.
we gave it to him.
And we did it in a time where now steel is like 5 times the price
Yeah.
and wood is 5 times the price. So we were able to pay for it
Yes.
at
It
a
was
great
cheaper to
price.
borrow the money, because we never would have, you know, what I mean, double, triple the
Just to
price.
get it done real
Yeah.
quickly.
Now.
Yeah, think how much that saved compared to if you started the
Okay.
project
No.
tomorrow. Yeah.
Yes.
That's
That's a guy.
That was a dog move.
And it had a cause.
That was a god, and it had a
That was
cause.
my first.
Okay, this is, okay, I'm gonna keep, all I'm doing is stimulating conversation here, okay? Number 4, a change of scenery. For us, just the experience that we had, well, you know, I've got the verse down there where God called Abraham and Sarah to a far country. Have you ever found that when you had to move from one place to another, that was an opportunity for God to do something fresh in your life? Just moves have, and I know we moved from Homer, New York to Pomona, California, and it's amazing how that triggered a new thing in our lives. But the one that we're experiencing right now that's very similar to it, this is so interesting what God's doing during the pandemic. This is so fascinating. What the enemy intended for evil, God is working for good.
Amen.
That has kind of been a theme for me this morning. And to hear other churches saying, yeah, we're having that same thing going on. Well, because we were doing renovations, we were meeting in a tent to begin with, so we're outdoors, like you know, your community terrace. And then eventually we've been in our gym while the renovations are happening in the worship center. Just a change of location has caused this fresh wind. It's been an interesting thing. And under the tents, it's so funny. I felt like I was pretending I was Billy Graham under a tent. You know? So the tent, but
All
the
of
tent
you
was
up there in the
fun.
bushes.
I will say, yeah, the tent, exactly. Yeah, I see you. Yeah, that all started with a tent in Los Angeles, right, with Billy Graham. But then we got tired of the tent. I'm looking at Eric Holzer here. I got tired of preaching outdoors after. At first it was really awesome. So then we went into the gym, and it's so interesting how this 150-year-old church that's always had a pretty nice sanctuary worship center, meeting in a gym, and we almost feel like a church plant. You know, now, don't you all feel like church plants after the pandemic, though? I mean, in some ways, don't you almost feel like we're all replanting another church? Just think from a pastor of a church 150 years old. We're almost feeling like we're replanting our church once again. And so just a different location has been something that's been fresh for us. Okay, let's turn the page over. More ideas. We're going to get to the weird ones in just a couple of minutes, so hang with me if these are kind of ho-hum. A long, steady obedience in the same direction. And I think, when you talk about a move of God, we tend to think, oh, we had a all-night prayer meeting, and then this happened, or Josh Hoosman talking about, by the way, I'm such a cynic, this is so terrible. I had lunch with Josh, who was just preaching. I said, did more than you feel the earthquake when the baptism happened? My God, I told you I was raised Presbyterian. So he said, yeah, they all felt it. Is that the best story?
Oh, yeah, that's
They all felt it, and they were actually worried for the infrastructure of their church.
Yeah.
They actually got an engineer in to check it, because they had all felt this earthquake, but it hadn't, nobody felt it, and it didn't come up on the, we all, Californians, we have all our apps, right? You can know in 60 seconds if there was an earthquake somewhere, right? And so anyway, so we tend to think when we talk move of God, we're talking something that we do this, and there's this quick thing. But there's another whole story out there, which is long, steady obedience in the same direction. Just, those of you right now, the pandemic is just one foot in front of the other.
Amen.
Just so if there's been a theme this morning here at the conference, it's been hang in there. Hang in there, everybody. We're going to be okay. But, I found that so encouraging that other churches were feeling that as well. In Galatians 6:9, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we don't give up. And my favorite example of this was, and you've heard this, so forgive me to do this to a room of church leaders. There's this amazing poem about just one set of footprints on the beach. No, just kidding. That's terrible. I remember once Kimberly and we were in our church back at home where we used to have open sharing time. And this one brand new Christian gets up there and goes, I just read the most amazing poem. And he proceeds to read footprints in the sand. Okay. If anybody hasn't read that, I'll show it to you. No, but the Chinese bamboo tree, That I think about that all the time in ministry, where what I understand, the Chinese bamboo tree, the farmer plants it, waters it, fertilizes it. After 1 year, nothing happens. Second year, waters it, fertilizes it, nothing happens. Third year, same thing. Fourth year, talk about insanity, doing the same thing over and over again. Fifth year, seventh year, waters it, fertilizes it. It grows 80 feet in the air in like the next 5 days or something like that, or 5 weeks. I'm getting my time periods wrong on that. Just boom. And I want to encourage you that in your ministries, you might be like the Chinese bamboo tree farmer. Okay, you just plugging along, and in some areas, it just seems like there's no progress whatsoever. And I just want to encourage you, maybe not this side of heaven. Certainly in heaven, you'll see the reward of that. But even this side of heaven, it's amazing how sometimes you can just keep plugging along, and all of a sudden, there's a shift. And here again, I want to be careful because numbers discourage us as much as they encourage us. But when I was in Homer, New York, I still remember, kind of like Tim Keller and his first church, just year after year, and this is a tiny bit of growth. Like 7 years, and maybe it grew from 200 to 300 in like 7 years. And I remember, and it's so weird how the Lord encourages you in that moment. You look back and like, why weren't you more discouraged? I remember one time just feeling like, we'd grown one person in the previous year. It was like 259 instead of 258. And I must have been young and dumb, but I was just kind of like, yes! At least we're moving in the same direction. Yes! And be thrilled about that. And so for 7 years, they just, grow from 200 to 300. And then all of a sudden, in the next 5 years, in this little village of 3,500 people, it grew from 300 to 1,200 in next 5 years.
Wow.
And this village of 3,500 people, just boom. And so I always remember that. Not that has to be the the typical for us, but sometimes you're just plowing along step after step after step. And if anything, I can just say, encourage it. Don't be weary in well-doing. Don't be weary in well-doing. I know with the pandemic, we have felt like, those of us at Purpose, like, man, the people just aren't coming back that fast. They just aren't coming back. And you're just like, where are they? Hello, are you out there? Where are they? And I think we're going to see something happen in these next few months that it's going to, we're going to get a bit of a bounce back. But I'll get into that more, how maybe they won't all come back. Did somebody say that this morning? That we're not going to necessarily pastor the church we pastored pre-pandemic? We'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, here's another one, number 6. Matching the right person to the right situation. Now I'm going to get into more kind of practical nitty-gritty things, okay? Tim Keller is a perfect example of that. How in Hopewell, New York, Hopewell, Virginia, forgive me, he was just a bad fit. I mean, if you know Tim Keller, he's like super intellectual. My hometown was not a super intellectual kind of place. It was very, down home, just not that way at all. You stick him in Manhattan with all these sophisticated, educated, we call them yuppies, I don't know what they're called nowadays, but these single, highly educated, millennials. And he was a perfect fit. And so sometimes in your church ministries, you gotta keep fiddling with people or yourself until you get into the right spot before it takes off. And you just got to keep looking. Where's that right thing that happens? And finding the right person from something. And sometimes it'll surprise you who that person is. So I'm going back to Homer now. And there was this one lady, and I'm saying this in the greatest, most loving way, but she was crazy. She was crazy. This lady was just out there, just way out there. And she kept coming to me with this ministry idea. How many of you have ever had a crazy person pitch a ministry idea? Yeah. And this was like, and she was very weird and flamboyant and just out there. But I kind of had this philosophy at that time that just lead with yes. Why not? Why not? Now, some of those things you don't want necessarily somebody untested teaching your high schoolers or something like that. You know what I mean? But at that point, so she had this idea that she wanted to minister to women that were victims of domestic violence. That was her thing. So I'm like, okay, well, that's not gonna. It'll either take off, or something will happen, or it won't happen, but it's not going to damage existing people within the church. So I said, why not? So encouraged her in starting this ministry to domestic violence. This crazy lady, by the time we left Homer, every judge in our county was mandating violent offenders to her program.
That's crazy ladies.
Yeah, exactly. Here's the crazy ladies. The judges.
Are crazy.
Yes. Any person, that was a victim of domestic violence or did domestic violence had to go through her Christian program to get out. And I was like, forgive me, God, forgive me for making that judgment on her. Now, don't get me wrong. You guys could all have stories of times you got burned for doing that too. But sometimes it's just finding the right person for the right spot. Anybody got a story on that? Then we'll get into the second.
I got a story.
Yes.
You said yes to that lady.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Gave it a shot. Yeah, and I have to admit it was low risk because it was kind of an outside the church kind of ministry. But yeah, to empower and to lead with the answer. Okay, let's get into some weirder ones here. All right. Number 7. I said finding the right match for the right person. Number 7 is firing the right person. And sometimes a move of God happens when you have the courage to get that person out of that spot. And this is the part of ministry. Those of you pastors, there's parts you would do for free, don't tell our trustees, but I would preach for free. I would do a lot of things for free. This is where you earn your paycheck, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And my hero in the Bible is Joash. This is horrible. Because he fired his own grandmother, all right? Anybody that fucking fires their own grandmother is... Now, it's even worse than that. He actually killed her. I have a saying, and this is such a harsh saying. Just slap me afterwards if you want to, but I always say you're not a real leader until you fired your best friend. Now, yeah, that's harsh. Is that cold? Is that cold? Yeah, yeah. So, or a friend, not your best friend. Hopefully, your best friend. Yeah. But you're not a real leader until you fired a friend, because you have to love what God is going to do or is doing more than you love that friendship. And that is the yucky part of ministry. But sometimes, you know, we get super spiritual on things, and maybe God's just saying, and you have to do it the right way, and you have to do it the right timing. Don't get me wrong. And the people from Purpose, the staff is just laughing because I am like the biggest coward there is. I have the spiritual gift of conflict avoidance. It's, it's my weak spot. It's my weak spot in leadership. I really hate conflict, and I'm just like, you know. So that's why you get a chief of staff. They do it for you, you know. So Greg can fire my friends. But just to be kind again. Loving people, and you know what I found is whenever you remove a person from something that they're not a good fit in within your church, that frees them up to do something that they...
That's a blessing.
I've got some situations where people are so happy now, you know, and I have to admit, when I've been fired from, you know, a situation in church where they say, Glenn, we don't want you to do that anymore. It hurts my feelings. And I'm kind of like, you know, I always wonder, did Moses cop an attitude with Jethro before he did what he did? You know, Jethro, his father-in-law, told Moses how he should be doing ministry, then how he's I just am always curious. I want to get to heaven and see the videotape on that. Like, did Moses get defensive in the meeting with Jethro? The first time Jethro said, you should do this in a different way. Did he get like this? And then said, no, you're right. I don't know. Maybe Moses was so spiritual. He was the most humble man that ever lived, right? So he instantly took his father-in-law's advice. Yeah, maybe he took the advice and did it right away. But you actually bless that person because subconsciously they know they're not a good fit in that as well. Or you're protecting the sheep from a toxic situation. So anyway, so sometimes it's removing a person from that. Number 8, I just put this one just from our church's story. You know, now 8th way to get God to move is to go bankrupt. There's a popular one, right? You know, but our no, what I mean by that is our church was facing bankruptcy back in 1993, and you know what? As a church leader, bankruptcy is your best friend. People are more open to change when they see bankruptcy. What's that proverb? I think the Message says sometimes you don't change when you see the light, but when you feel the heat. And you know, in churches that face crises, our church faced a crisis where we had overbuilt a big sanctuary and weren't able to pay for it. And you know, there was threatened of the city repossessing it, turning it into a civic hall instead of a place of worship. And you know what? People are very open to change when you say, guess what? We either do this. The hardest thing in the world sometimes is success as a church, because it's so hard to get. What's the hardest thing is to get a successful church to change before they become unsuccessful, to reach the next generation. That is very, very hard to say, because everybody's like, look, it's working so great. And we're in that process now in our church where I have always transitioned the church to the generation that I myself am in. So in Homer, my job was to transition a church from a builder church, World War II generation church, to a boomer church. Wow. And then came to Pomona, again, builder to boomer, I'm a baby boomer. But now we're transitioning from a boomer church to a next generation church, millennial, next gen, whatever, Gen X, whatever you want to call it. And so as a result, I can't fly like you're flying a plane. You just look out the window on a clear day and you just fly the plane. When you get into the clouds, you have to go by the instruments, you know, and my son's an air traffic controller, and he talked to a guy in a cloud up in Bakersfield and had a whole family of 4 die, you know, because they weren't instrument rated and couldn't follow his instructions as an air traffic controller in the middle of clouds. And so right now, I am having to ask those of younger generations to be my instrument panel, to say, tell me which way to turn here, because my instincts are they're not all wrong, but there are many things that are wrong. don't have JT there, yeah. But your instincts are wrong. Your instincts are like, oh, go left and you should go right, or vice versa. So anyway, that sometimes when you know, so success, our church is a fairly successful boomer church, but convincing people to make changes to reach the next generation before you're in trouble is a much harder thing. Much harder thing than it was before. You know, I found it so much easier to introduce change when you're facing bankruptcy than when you're successful. But you got to do it in order to be prepared for the next generation. You know, I don't think God means for our churches to die after one generation. You know. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and fly through, and then I'm going to give you the rest of the time to give ideas. So be thinking of ideas or different ones, either examples of what I'm talking about or new ones that I have not thought about. That leads perfectly into number 9. Set the stage for the move of God in future generations. You know, maybe what you're called to do right now is not necessarily to see a move of God, but to prepare a move of God that's going to happen in the future after you're even gone. You know, after you're gone, you're laying the foundation for the next team of leaders of a younger generation for them to see the move of God. And this is hard. You know, Andy Stanley talks about how the older, in general, and there's huge exceptions to this, I know, but in general, the older people have the money and the younger people have the ideas. And Andy Stanley even says something like, you don't get any truly fresh ideas after the age of 40, which I don't know if that's true, because there are all kinds of great inventors after 40. But there's some truth to that, that the young men and women are seeing visions, and the old, I'm just making this up, I'm making up scripture. The old men and women have the money, and the younger men and women have the visions. And you have to convince the older to fund the visions of the younger, which is hard, you know. I had somebody say to me a few months ago, you got to keep the tithers happy, you know. And he meant by that older tithers. Got to keep them happy. And I think that is like the worst thing I ever heard. I said, that is terrible to say that. But what you got to do is you got to motivate people that have the resources to fund those that have the dreams. And so, number 9, Psalm 78, we will tell the next generation, even the children yet to be born. Think of that. Your role in your church right now might be to build the foundation for there to be a move of God for children not yet even born. Think about that for a moment. You might be setting the stage for kids that aren't even born yet, in order for them to have a move of God. That's what David, I love how David, God told him he couldn't build the temple, but what did he do? God didn't tell him he couldn't do a fundraiser for the temple. And so he raises all the money for all these materials, even though God told him he couldn't do it. Solomon was going to build the temple, but he could still build the refuge for it, or the resources for it. I have this thing, and this is a little bit of a challenge to older leadership, and you take this or leave it, because this might sound too bombastic or whatever, but my goal is to retire with 0 chips, political chips. You know how they talk about, what's that old thing about church leadership? You gain chips. Dane will remember this because we were raised on this stuff. You get political chips, you know, every time you do a hospital visit, every time You do something that works, you get political chips, then you spend your chips to convince the church to do something new, and you risk your chips, and then if it works, you get more chips. If it doesn't work, you've got to build your chips up again before you can convince them to do another move. Well, my goal as leader is, you know, I don't want to retire and everybody's just singing my praises. Oh, how can we live without Glenn? You know what I mean? I hope I end on a good note. So I
Throw the bum out.
yeah, throw the bum out. Yes! I've been asking our younger leaders, what are the, and as an old man, I said it inappropriately the first time. I said, what are the dirty things you need me to do? And they said, Glenn, no, Glenn, you don't say it that way. What are the unpopular things? What are the unpopular things that I need to do? And I've actually kind of have a list of, these are the unpopular things I need to do, that I don't want to leave that to a younger leader who has no chips. You know, why would I leave that unpopular thing? And back to the one about firing the right people, the younger leaders, man, if they try to remove some leader that's entrenched, it ain't gonna go well, you know what I mean? And it doesn't go well with me either, but it goes better because I've got 30 years of chips than it will with a chipless, I'm just making this up right now, who knows how this is gonna turn out, a chipless younger leader. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, let me just finish up because I want to save time for you guys. Number 10, you're gonna love this one. Another way to have a move of God, go through a pandemic. There's a popular one. We didn't have any choice in it. But I love this quote by Lois McMaster Buchholz. Well, what is a blessing but a curse from another point of view? Yeah. And you know what, if we have time at the end, I'm gonna save some time. I'd love to hear some ways that you saw the pandemic as a blessing in your church, because we've seen the blessing in our church, some of us. I love this one, Mokahana. To a fireman, wind is a curse. To a sailor, wind is a blessing. Isn't that a great quote? I love that, yeah. And then T.D. Jakes, this one I like. Isn't it funny how something that will later be a blessing can be a curse if you get it too soon?
Yeah, that's so true.
And here's how I want to apply this one, is how many of you are kind of tired of the pandemic going on and on and on? Yes. And I wonder if God, you know, I keep saying, Lord, now, year's enough, that a year and a half's enough, 2 years enough, but maybe He realizes it's more of a blessing if it goes on a little bit longer. I hope that we're at the end of saying that. Let's say this is application from 6 months ago, but there are some things that are happening late in the pandemic that have been just as much a blessing as things that happened early in the pandemic. And you know, one thing, I was just talking to Aaron McCrae from Hillside, and he loved this. He loved this phrase I said. He had never heard it before. But you know what we're having in the pandemic? We're having what they call a Scottish revival. Okay, so some of us little guys, we know what we're talking about. Yeah, exactly. My old classmate from Gordon Conwell out in Boston knows that. A Scottish revival is where most revivals, they preach, and the church like triples in size, or lots of people come to Christ. And a Scottish revival, as I understand, oh no, Karen's this. The way I understand a Scottish revival is the church shrinks. The more you preach, the more it shrinks. And I'm guessing where that comes from is they must have just preached hard against sin. And so hard against sin that the church got smaller. So it's like a tongue-in-cheek, it's like a joke. You know, a Scottish revival is when the church actually gets smaller rather than bigger. I think the pandemic might be a Scottish revival. Meaning there is a sifting going on.
The remnant. Yeah, the remnant.
Yeah, and even stuff like people, how many of you have lost people from both sides of certain issues? You know, yeah. Hold my hands up. We're all going to worship for a while in our pain. Yes, at our church, and this is interesting, and I think it's probably going to be typical of TM churches because we tend to be, I like to think of us as more balanced and things. So we've lost people because of masks, being too okay, it's conservative, liberal, which one applies to which? Too cautious, thank you, yes. Conservative and liberal doesn't apply, it's all mixed up, and who's liberal, who's conservative. Cautious, so we've lost people early in the pandemic because we were too cautious. Now we're maybe losing people from the other end because we're not cautious enough. We're getting that backlash right now. You know, and gosh, you want to get into political things and other things, but you lose from both ends. But here's what I found is that I think we're going to come out of the pandemic with the people that we do have still left in our church are going to be more our DNA.
That's good. I like that.
Rooted.
Kind of, and you got to be careful not to rejoice over every person you lose. Otherwise, it's just you and your wife, and maybe not her. You know? So you want to be careful. But I think there is a certain comfort in that. I have found, you know what? I think we're going to come out of the pandemic, and we may be smaller. You know, we're going to be smaller. We're going to come out of it smaller, but the people we do have are going to be more unified vision that this is where we're going, and we're not going to get, you know, shot from the two sides, because those have kind of. And then let's just say, let's be gracious. Let's say they just went to a church that was more what fits where they're at. You know, I don't want to be so arrogant as to think that anybody leaves our church is a bad person. No, they just now they're at a church that better suits them. So there's this shuffling going on during the pandemic, and maybe when we come out of it, the body of Christ is going to be more well. Did I talk about getting the right person in the right spot? Well, that applies here, doesn't it? Maybe getting everybody in the right church that has the same vision, so we can march more unified and not always fighting with each other.
Amen.
Alrighty, okay, two more. Transition to an outward paradigm. I have found there's the parable of the lost sheep and the 99. I found that this is a major thing for a move of God, is to help, and this is an ongoing battle to get our people to think outward rather than inward. And that's just leadership. We're doing that all the time, aren't we? I love this quote by Andy Stanley. Every church's gravitational pull is towards the 99. You know, the 99 sheep that are already in the flock, the pull is always towards them because they're in front of us. You know, they're our friends. They're our board members. They're the ones that you're counting on to teach that second grader class on Sunday morning. You got to take care of them. And so it's always pulling towards them rather than the one lost sheep. And I love this other one by Dave Browning. He said, there are two tensions in a church, outreach and nurture. Without intentionality, nurture always wins. And so to constantly keep getting our church to have an outward focus, that's just ongoing, you know, move of God. The analogy we use in our church is the Titanic. When the Titanic sank, you've heard the stories. There were three groups of people. Okay, there were those drowning in the water. There were those that rowed with half-full boats as far away from the drowning people as they could get. Oh gosh! Just want to protect themselves. I don't want a drowning person swamping my boat. So they had half-full boats, and they just rowed as far away so they wouldn't get sucked in with the Titanic when it went down. They wouldn't get swamped by the drowning people. And then, now this part I'm kind of making up. I don't know if this actually happened. But then there were those, this is true. There were those that did go back and brought some people into the boat.
Yeah.
Okay, so there were three. So some that saved them, some that got as far away as they could, some that were drowning. And I think that's the three types of churches. There are some churches that are so passionate about identifying with the drowning people. You know, they want to be like them. Hey, the more I can be culturally like them and I can remove the distinctives of the gospel so that I don't offend anybody. Those people, I think, get pulled in, and now they become drowning as well.
Yeah.
Because they're so, and their heart's in the right place, but they're too much emphasis on love and not enough on truth. And so they get pulled in the water, so they're drowning, so they end up just part of the drowning people. Then there are those churches that just stay as far away from lost people as possible. You know, protect our huddle, you know, let's protect our holiness, let's stay together. But we want to be the types of churches, don't we? That's what the whole morning was about. Getting close enough to pull drowning people into our boat,
Yeah, there we go.
but not so close that we get pulled in ourselves.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, and one last something, do something way outside of your comfort zone. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. And, there again, just, this is more of a personal story. And this is good, we're going to have 15 minutes to get your feedback on any additional ones that you think of. But this is more personal, but this is more not a church story, but our family story. My wife, Kimberly, and Poor Purpose people have heard this story over and over again, but I was single as a pastor in Homer, New York. And so I was 24 years old, single, not married. And third Sunday I'm there, Kimberly walks in the door. She'd just come to Christ at Boston University. And I'm like checking her out, which sounds creepy for a pastor to be checking out women. She was single, I was single, it was all legitimate, not creepy, maybe a little creepy, not a lot creepy. And so I said, man, I need to get to know her. She comes back the next Sunday, true story, with her fiance. Oh. And she wants me to. They want me to perform the wedding. Oh man! So I call them into one counseling, and I say, your tests are just not to lie. As you can. Serious malpractice, pastoral malpractice. I did that to a group of psychologists once. Still that same story I've told 100 times at Azusa Pacific. The look of horror on their faces. They were ready. No. I prayed about it, and he died about 6 months later. That's not true either. That's a lie. He didn't die. No. They broke up their engagement on their own. And,
That's not it either.
That's true. What's that?
That's not it either.
Yeah, I know. That part's true.
Okay.
So anyway, so then she starts talking to me about, I really want to adopt kids. I want to maybe have a couple of kids of our own, but then I really want to go down to South America and walk into an orphanage and adopt a couple of kids. And I'm like, I've never had that thought. And this girl's crazy. But I want to keep dating her, so I'm like, are you kidding me? That's my passion too. That's awesome. Yeah, we're soulmates. We had this dream. We totally had the same dream. But we got married. We had a couple of girls, and I still remember she's sitting in the hospital with the baby, and then the 2-year-old Abby standing there, and she goes, "We're gonna go get our boys now." I'm like, wow, she didn't forget. I thought it was like a youthful thing, in the past. So we adopted a couple of boys from down in Cali, Colombia, when they were 6 and 8. And then we had foster kids, and we adopted a couple of them. So 4 of our 6 are adopted. And I'm telling you, that was never in my life plan. How many of you, your life has turned out differently than you thought it was going to? The older you are, the more quickly your hand's going up. Yeah. But it has been the greatest adventure. It has been wonderful, just wonderful. And, and so why? Because it was something totally outside of our comfort zone. It was something I never thought to do. And yet sometimes that crazy thing, like you talked about with the meals, or like other people have talked about examples, that can be the thing that triggers something that God does, that's a move of God, especially. Other examples, either examples of the 12 that I gave you, or ones that are not in there. Yes?
A Scottish revival in West Virginia. A Christian leader decades ago visited a church in the Appalachians, and it was full, it was rocking and rolling, and the Christian leader went up to him afterwards and said, "What did you do?" He said, "Well, our previous pastor left, and I was a deacon, and no one else would preach. And I preached that church down to 10. And he built up.
And then it built up after that. That is a great example. Somebody's going to preach a church down to 10. I've heard that so many times from people that it could have did this before it did this. And I think pandemic did make the whole body of Christ might be doing this so that it can do this, maybe. Yes?
Yeah, Glenn, this is from one of my friends. I can't take credit for it, but he reminded me on the outward focus thing. He challenged us a while ago for me to lead my staff through this question. We call it the Luke 15 question. is how much time and energy do we want to spend welcoming the prodigal home versus convincing the older brother to join the party? And so we had a conversation with staff about that question to define if the next season of ministry, is it going to be about trying to convince people who left the church to come back, or are we going to welcome the people who are lost that want to come back? And it started to change the trajectory of what we were focusing our energy and attention and money on.
That is the coolest thing.
I can't take credit for it, I just did it, but I thought it was brilliant.
Yes, that is such a good question. My goodness. Yes. Oh, let me go. Somebody hadn't done it yet. We're gonna say, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to this church that, and I'm hitting number 7.
Yes.
Firing.
Yes, yes. Oh, yeah.
So I was going to this church back in 1998, and it was building about 100 new people every month.
Oh, good.
And we got there when it was 1,200 people. By the second year, it was about 4,000. And then within so many, now the pastor was doing 5 services, 2 on Saturday, 3 on Sunday. And then something occurred with his best friend was the pastor, was his second in command. And he did something that he was not supposed to do so you're never supposed to have be with a woman